I pointed my flashlight at a Bigfoot, sitting with its back against the barn wall, and what frightened me was not its size, but the way it pulled the juvenile behind its back when it saw the handgun at my hip. The smell of mud, dried blood, and wet fur hung thick in the air. It was breathing heavily, one leg stretched out stiffly, its left shoulder smeared with straw. The smaller one trembled, making a choked crying sound like a child trying not to sob. I was standing less than 10 feet away from them, when a long howl rose from the forest behind the barn. Then 3 pairs of shining eyes appeared between the trees. "Victor here." What you are about to hear originated from a series of posts that once appeared in a community devoted to discussing Sasquatch, then gradually spread across blogs and forums that archive strange incidents from the Pacific Northwest. According to the account, the central figure was a sheriff who had worked for many years in a rural county. There is no official report or public document sufficient to confirm that this encounter ever took place. It may be a memory retold over many years, a story that became exaggerated, or simply a modern legend that never disappeared. I am not going to try to convince you to believe it or deny it. Listen for yourself and draw your own conclusion. If you have ever witnessed something science still cannot explain, comment Bigfoot and share your story. And now, let us return to the moment when everything began to change. 2:17 in the morning. At 2:17 a.m., the county sheriff's office was nearly swallowed by the kind of silence Eli Mercer had grown used to after years of working night shifts. Fluorescent lights shone down on a desk covered in paperwork. The coffee machine in the corner had gone cold long ago, and beyond the window there was only darkness and late November drizzle covering the empty road. Eli was reviewing a vehicle collision report when Martha Cole, the night dispatcher, transferred a call from Tom Ridley's farm outside Jewel. Tom's voice over the line sounded very different from the irritation he usually had when calling to report cattle breaking a fence or hunters driving across private land. He spoke quickly, breathing hard, then lowered his voice as though afraid someone in the barn might hear him. About 10 minutes earlier, a heavy impact from the old livestock barn behind the house had pulled him out of bed. At first Tom thought someone was stealing feed, because in late fall there were occasionally drifters looking for a place to sleep or teenagers sneaking onto farms to take things. He put on a coat, picked up the shotgun he kept near the back door, and stepped onto the porch. Halfway across the yard, he heard the wooden floor inside the barn shaking under footsteps so heavy that even the doorboards trembled faintly in the dark. Tom stopped. Right afterward, a deep, long, hoarse groan came from inside, like the sound of a very large animal in pain. A few seconds later came a higher sound, small and broken, which made Tom think of a child trying not to cry. It was that second sound that made him return to the house, lock the door, and call the police instead of going farther. Eli asked whether the barn held livestock. Tom said the cattle were in the enclosed barn to the east, while the old barn mostly stored hay, a few feed sacks, and rarely used tools. That detail made Eli pause. A hungry bear might go after feed, but the childlike sound still had no reasonable explanation. He told Tom to stay inside, put down the shotgun, and only use it if someone actually tried to force their way through the door. After hanging up, Eli put on a heavy coat, took a large flashlight, and checked his radio. He left the patrol shotgun mounted in the SUV, because at that point he still believed he was heading out to deal with an injured black bear, a panicked drifter, or a break-in stranger than usual. The road to the Ridley farm ran through dark stretches of forest, where fir and alder trees stood packed closely on both sides like walls. Eli drove slowly through the last section because the gravel road was muddy, and he did not want to use a siren or emergency lights. He knew Tom was frightened, and if there really was a bear trapped in the barn, loud noise would only agitate it. When he turned through the farm's wooden gate, Eli saw the one-story house with the kitchen lights on, the cattle barn sitting lower to the east, and the old barn separated from it near the forest edge to the west. The first thing he noticed was that the large door of the old barn stood open by a few inches. Tom had insisted he had latched it before going to bed. Eli stopped the vehicle some distance from the house and stepped out. Tom cracked open the front door, one hand on the frame, the other still holding the shotgun, despite being told to put it down. Eli signaled him to leave it inside. Tom did so but did not take his eyes off the barn. He said he had not heard any more heavy sounds since making the call, only an occasional faint scraping. Eli told him to stay on the porch and not follow. As he crossed the yard, Eli began to notice that something about the farm's silence felt wrong. The cattle in the eastern barn were all awake and pressed into the farthest corner, their heads turned toward the old barn. They were not lowing or stamping. The entire herd simply stood crowded together as if waiting for something to pass. Tom's two dogs, Buck and Mabel, normally ran out barking at any vehicle entering the yard, but that night they had crawled deep beneath the porch. Buck whimpered softly when Eli passed and backed farther into the darkness. Eli had seen dogs afraid of bears, mountain lions, and thunder, but the way both animals avoided, even looking toward the barn, sent a chill along his neck, although the wind was nearly still. He forced himself to do the familiar things first. Eli checked the driveway, fence line, and soft ground around the barn for tire tracks, boot prints, or signs of forced entry. There was no unfamiliar vehicle. One feed sack lay outside the shelter with its mouth torn open, and a drag mark leading through the mud. The strange part was that the drag mark went toward the barn, exactly the opposite direction a thief would take feed toward a vehicle. Eli crouched to inspect the latch. The old metal piece was bent, but the pressure marks suggested the main force had come from the inside. He placed a hand on the door and pushed gently. The hinges creaked dryly. Something shifted deep in the darkness, heavy and slow, then stopped immediately. Eli remained motionless for several seconds, listening. The silence returned so quickly that he had the feeling whatever was inside was listening to him as well. Tom stood on the porch nearly 70 yards away, both arms folded across his chest. Eli looked back and motioned for him to go inside, then lowered the radio volume and opened the retaining strap over his holstered pistol. He still did not draw it. Before stepping across the threshold, Eli shone his flashlight down onto the mud. The beam stopped on an impression clearly longer than his boot. The print had a tapered heel, a broad front, and 5 toes pointing forward. Eli stared at it longer than he wanted to admit. A bear track can look remarkably human when the hind foot overlaps the front, and he knew that. Even so, the print in front of him was too clean in the important places. He saw no claw marks. The toes separated naturally, and the middle of the foot was narrower than the forefoot. Eli placed his boot next to the impression for comparison, then immediately felt foolish, because no comparison was going to turn it into something familiar. He estimated the track at 17 or 18 inches long. Inside the barn, another print was more blurred, stretched at the edge, as though its owner had been dragging one leg. Eli reminded himself that mud, poor light, and angles could create all sorts of misleading shapes. The smell inside the barn hit him immediately. Wet earth, decaying leaves, old wood, fermenting straw, and a layer of musky odor so strong he had to breathe through his mouth. Beneath it all was the thin but unmistakable metallic smell of blood. His flashlight swept over empty troughs, tools hanging from posts, and bales of hay stacked along the wall. Straw had been pulled into the far corner and pressed into a broad depression like a temporary bed. Several feed sacks had been torn open with crude force, kernels of corn scattered across the floor. Eli stopped at a horizontal beam when he noticed dark smears on it. He touched the edge with a gloved fingertip and examined it closely. The blood had partially dried. The mark sat close to his shoulder height, while several drops appeared lower on the floor. That brought back the idea of an injured animal, but the tracks still refused to match any animal he knew. From the far end of the barn came deep breathing, heavy and rhythmic. The breathing stopped when Eli took one step, then resumed several seconds later when he stood still. This time he was certain the thing in the darkness was reacting to his movement. He drew his pistol, but kept the barrel angled toward the floor, avoiding raising the flashlight too high. Eli called out that he was the sheriff and that if anyone was inside, they should speak. Instead, a small sound came from the same area, higher than the breathing and trembling like the throat of a frightened child. For a few seconds he thought Tom might have been right in the worst possible way. Perhaps an injured person was in there with a child. He moved farther into the center aisle, checking each illuminated corner as he went. When the flashlight beam passed a support post, something behind a feeding trough shifted faintly. The light swung back and caught a hand gripping the edge of the wood. He saw 5 long, thick fingers, brown-black hair covering the back of the hand, while the palm was dark and nearly bare. It was larger than any human hand he had ever seen. Eli felt his stomach tighten. His mind tried to fit what he was seeing into a bear, a person in a fur suit, a prank, anything that belonged to ordinary life. But the hand tightened around the trough edge and released with too much deliberate control. Eli changed his position and moved the light to the right. A massive body gradually emerged into the beam. It sat with its back against the far wall of the barn, broad shoulders filling almost the entire space between the posts. Even seated, its head came nearly to Eli's chest. He estimated that if it stood upright, it had to be more than 7 feet tall. Dark brown hair covered its body, matted with mud, water, and straw. The left shoulder had a patch of fur stuck together with dried blood, while the right leg extended at a rigid angle, making it immediately clear that this was the source of the dragged track. The creature raised its face as the light reached it. Eli saw a low forehead, broad jaw, wide nose, and deep-set eyes reflecting the light, but not with the vacant look of livestock. Its gaze focused directly on him. When Eli accidentally held the beam on its face too long, it raised one arm to shield its eyes. That simple gesture made him lower the light almost reflexively. In that moment, a very small sound came from behind the creature's hip. Eli tilted his head, moved the beam toward the straw, and saw another body. The smaller individual stood about 4 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair, crouched tight against the wall. It looked at Eli with wide eyes and pressed closer to the adult. Eli felt his fear change. He still knew that a large, injured creature, less than 10 feet away, could kill someone if it panicked, but the scene in front of him no longer looked like an animal waiting to ambush him. The adult turned its shoulder, used its stronger arm to pull the juvenile behind its back, and put its own body between the smaller one and Eli's gun. The juvenile tried to peek around the shoulder. The larger one held it back and made a low sound in its throat. Eli lowered the gun barrel another few inches. He understood that the crying Tom had heard came from this smaller individual. Part of him still wanted to back out of the barn, call everyone available, and let someone else decide what to do. But another part realized that doing so could turn this fragile situation into chaos. He remained where he was, lowered the flashlight toward the floor, and said in a low voice that he would not come any closer. The large creature watched him, breathing heavily but evenly. When Eli shifted half a step sideways to open more space, it bared its teeth and pulled the juvenile closer. He stopped immediately. The air in the barn seemed to tighten between 3 bodies measuring every movement. Eli heard rain tapping on the metal roof and his own heartbeat in his ears. Then, a long, low howl rose from the forest behind the barn, powerful enough that the sound seemed to pass through the wooden wall itself. The juvenile instantly straightened. The adult turned its head toward the forest, with a speed completely unlike the sluggishness caused by its injury. Eli watched both reactions and understood that the howl was not an unfamiliar sound to them. Before he could think further, another call came from beyond the tree line, shorter and closer than the first. The second howl came from the forest behind the barn, closer than the first, making Eli feel as though the darkness out there had just moved several dozen yards nearer. He stayed in place, flashlight still lowered toward the floor, pistol pointed below knee level. The adult, leaning against the wall, suddenly tensed its entire body. It looked toward the barn door, then at Eli, then lowered its head toward the juvenile, as if calculating something. Eli did not know whether he was assigning human thought to its behavior, but the sequence was too orderly to dismiss as random reflex. Only then did he realize he was standing almost directly between the two creatures and the widest exit. The thought made him step slowly to the right, keeping his shoulder angled and avoiding any movement that might feel like an approach. The adult tracked every step. As the space in front of the door opened, its shoulders lowered slightly, and the hand holding the juvenile loosened. Eli noticed the change and began to understand that distance might matter more than words. He shifted another half step and stopped. The juvenile leaned its head out from behind the large arm and looked toward the door, but instead of running, it lowered itself beside an old water trough. The trough had been dry for years. The smaller creature licked the damp wood along the bottom edge, then looked up with its mouth slightly open, eyes moving constantly between Eli and the adult. The detail made him think they might have been sheltering in the barn for many hours. Near the side door sat a metal bucket Tom usually used for horses. Eli remembered seeing it half filled with rainwater when he entered. He slowly backed toward it, bending at the knees instead of suddenly leaning over, then dragged the bucket into the open. The adult immediately made a low sound in its throat. Eli stopped, removed his hand from the handle, and did not advance. After several seconds, he used the toe of his boot to push the bucket a short distance and then backed all the way toward the doorway. The juvenile stared at the water, then at the adult. It stepped out once, was pulled back by the larger hand, and froze. Eli continued backing until his shoulders were almost against the doorframe. This time the adult only watched him and made no sound. The juvenile slowly approached, knees bent slightly, hands almost touching the floor. It lowered its head to the bucket and drank quickly, occasionally looking up to check the adult. Eli felt a strange sense of relief, but did not mistake it for safety. The distance between them was still far too small, and something else was clearly approaching from the forest. His shoulder electroing through crackled, the sharp electronic noise tearing through the silence. The adult snapped its head toward Eli and pulled the juvenile behind itself again. Martha called his name a second time, asking for his status and whether he needed additional units. Eli hurriedly turned the volume down, backed out of the barn, and did not answer until he was outside the threshold. He knew standard procedure required a clear report when facing dangerous wildlife or an unidentified intruder, but there was no way to describe what was behind him without turning the entire county into a hunt within half an hour. He told Martha there were 2 unidentified large animals, one apparently injured, and asked her to keep the other units where they were. Martha was silent for several seconds, then asked whether he was sure he did not need backup. Eli looked into the barn and saw the juvenile pressed against the adult, while the injured creature stared directly toward the door. He said the situation was stable and he would call if that changed. At that moment, Martha said Tom had called the line again and wanted to know why Eli had not finished dealing with the problem and whether he should leave the house. Eli turned toward the house. Through the kitchen window, Tom's silhouette stood motionless behind the curtain. Eli walked several yards into the yard, far enough for the farmer to see his gestures, and signaled him to stay inside. Tom cracked the front door and quietly asked whether it was a bear. Eli hesitated. He had handled many bears entering sheds, seen mountain lions caught in traps, and had once had to shoot an injured deer after a collision. None of that had prepared him to answer this simple question. In the end, he only said he had never seen anything like it before and told Tom to keep the gun in the house. The short answer changed the farmer's expression completely. Tom asked nothing more, stepped back inside, and shut the door. A heavy creak of wood came from the barn. Eli turned just in time to see the adult brace one hand against the wall and try to lift itself. For several seconds it almost stood, revealing its true size more clearly than at any point before. Its shoulders were higher than Eli's head, its chest broad, its arms nearly reaching its knees. But as soon as its weight shifted onto the right leg, the entire body locked. It buckled, struck its shoulder against a wooden post, and released a deep groan. The juvenile immediately pressed against it, both hands touching the larger arm. Fresh blood seeped through the fur around the injured shoulder. Eli understood immediately that simply opening the door and waiting for them to leave would not be enough. The adult could fight if cornered, but it might not be capable of crossing the yard to the forest. A third howl came moments later, shorter and closer than the previous two. The juvenile snapped its head up. The adult stayed still for several seconds, then produced 3 interrupted low sounds, each separated by a breath. The forest went silent. Then an answer came from the west, followed by another deeper sound from the north. Eli felt his stomach tighten. 2 different directions meant at least 2 individuals were out there. He stepped away from the barn door to look toward the tree line, but did not go far. The flashlight beam swept low over wet grass, fence posts, and pale alder trunks. In a gap between 2 firs, the light caught 2 reflective points higher than his eye level. They disappeared sideways rather than dropping lower the way deer eyes would when the animal turned its head. Eli immediately stopped shining directly at them and moved the beam down. A large branch shook about 30 yards ahead, even though there was almost no wind. He heard the scrape of wood against bark, then a breath or snort too far away to identify. From the house, Tom appeared to notice the movement too. The front door opened slightly. Eli turned and shouted for him to close it and stay inside. The shout startled the juvenile inside the barn, which released a rapid series of high sounds. The adult instinctively tried to rise again, pulling its injured leg under its body and slamming its shoulder against the wall. Eli immediately lowered his voice. He realized human reactions could make the situation worse, even when the intention was protection. He went to the SUV, shut off the headlights shining toward the forest, and let the yard fall into softer darkness. When he returned, he used only the flashlight pointed low near his feet. Something suddenly dropped to the ground just outside the beam, heavy enough to make a dry impact on the wet leaves. Eli froze. His first instinct was to reach for his gun, but the object had not been thrown at him and had struck nothing nearby. He waited several seconds and then shone the light to the side. A fresh branch, nearly as thick as his wrist, lay across the path between the barn and the forest. The break at one end was pale, the wood fibers newly torn. Eli stepped closer for a better look. Immediately, a low knock sounded against a tree from the left. He stopped. When he backed away, there was no further sound. He tried moving several steps left, keeping his distance from the branch. Another knock came from the opposite side. The coincidence became difficult to ignore. Eli did not know whether it was a warning, a territorial boundary, or a response to his movement, but he understood that he was being watched. He backed toward the barn door. In the darkness, every sound in the woods stopped with him. That chilled him more than a howl would have. A panicked animal normally runs, growls, or avoids you. Whatever stood in the tree line seemed to be waiting to see what he would do next. Eli looked back at the adult. It was no longer focused on him. Its gaze kept turning through the doorway toward the forest. The juvenile stood near the threshold, body leaning toward the outside, but every time the adult shifted a hand, the smaller one stepped back against it. Eli began putting the pieces together. If the howls were calls, the group in the forest might be searching for these two. If so, then he, the SUV, the headlights, and the brightly lit farmhouse stood directly between the barn and the woods, possibly explaining why the others had not approached more closely. What had begun as a break-in investigation had turned into a situation Eli had never been trained to handle. He was standing between unidentified creatures and other members of their group. He decided to change his objective. Instead of controlling the barn, he needed to create a quiet corridor wide enough for the two inside to have a chance to leave. The only problem was that the adult could barely walk on its right leg. Eli returned to the SUV. He got inside, started the engine without turning on the lights, and slowly backed the vehicle toward the edge of the yard near Tom's house. The engine noise made the cattle stir, the juvenile retreat farther inside the barn, and the forest leaves rustle more strongly. Eli stopped, shut off the engine, and got out immediately to show that the movement was over. When he circled back along a wide path, avoiding walking directly toward the branch on the ground, there were no warning knocks. That strengthened his sense that the group out there was reacting to approach angles rather than trying to drive him off the entire property. Eli stood beside the barn door, farther from the adult than before. He watched the juvenile step close to the threshold and look over the dark yard. From the forest came a series of very low sounds. The juvenile answered with one short call. The adult turned its head toward it, then looked at Eli again. For the first time that night, Eli felt that everyone's objective might be aligned. All sides wanted the two inside the barn to leave without anyone else getting hurt. But that understanding remained fragile. Tom could panic and come back out with the shotgun. A deputy might arrive on his own if Martha lost contact. One of the shapes in the woods could decide the distance was close enough. Eli checked the radio, kept the volume low, and confirmed with Martha that he was all right. He asked her again to hold the other units, then turned the speaker volume almost completely down. After that, he stood to one side of the entrance, leaving the path from the barn into the yard open. The adult watched him. It braced a hand on the floor and tried to pull its good leg under its body. The juvenile stood beside it, trembling slightly. Eli did not move in to help. He understood that every good intention would become meaningless if getting closer was interpreted as a threat. Outside, a shadow shifted through a gap between the trees. This time, Eli did not shine the flashlight directly at it. His eyes had adjusted enough to the low light to notice an upright figure and abnormally broad shoulders. A second shadow appeared farther left. Then a third shape emerged between two fir trunks, taller than the other two. They did not come fully into the yard. The three figures stood just at the edge of the trees, nearly blending into the darkness if he had not known where to look. Eli felt his throat go dry. Seeing one injured individual in the barn had already shaken everything. He believed he understood about these woods. Seeing an organized group made the feeling much deeper. The juvenile looked at them and gave a short, high sound. A deep answer came from the largest shadow. The adult in the barn shifted, trying to lift its shoulder away from the wall. Eli backed another step and kept his hand far from his gun. He did not know whether the gesture meant anything to the creatures outside, but he wanted every part of his body to communicate the same thing. The path was open. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the largest shadow separated from the tree line. It took exactly one step forward, enough for its shoulders and head to become visible against the gray sky, and stopped. The other two remained in place. Eli could not draw a full breath. The large creature outside did not look toward the farmhouse, the cattle, or the SUV. It stared directly at the barn door, where the juvenile stood beside the injured adult, with its head tilted as if confirming something. The largest individual remained at the tree line for several seconds, only one step separating it from the forest darkness. But for Eli, that distance was enough to change the entire situation. He was used to seeing a threat and asking what it might do next. This time, what held his attention was the direction of the creature's gaze. It did not care about Tom's house, the cattle crowded in the eastern barn, or the police SUV parked near the yard. It looked directly at the barn entrance, where the juvenile stood close beside the injured adult. The juvenile made a short, higher sound than the low calls from the forest, then leaned forward as though wanting to rush across the yard. The large creature at the trees answered almost immediately with a long, low sound. The idea forming in Eli's mind became clearer. The howls were not threats directed at the farm. The group outside was calling to the two individuals trapped inside the barn. The injured adult understood that too. It planted its large hand on the floor, pushed its back away from the wall, and tried to pull its good leg under its body. The juvenile turned back immediately and placed a smaller hand on its arm. Eli stood angled beside the doorway, keeping the opening as wide as possible. He did not want to remain between the two sides any longer than necessary. The adult managed to raise itself higher than before, using the wooden post for support. In a nearly upright position, its body filled almost the entire doorway. The juvenile stepped out first, went about 3 feet, and stopped. It turned back to look at the adult, then moved exactly 1 step back inside. Eli saw that action and understood that the smaller one would not run to the group outside if the injured adult remained behind. From the beginning of the night, he had viewed everything through professional habits: distance, strength, exits, and risk of attack. Now he was looking at a relationship. The juvenile feared the forest less than it feared leaving the adult behind. The realization affected him more deeply than he wanted to admit. The injured individual leaned its shoulder against the post, braced itself for the first step, moved the good leg across the threshold, and dragged the right leg after it. The motion was slow and stiff, but successful. Eli felt a flash of hope. If it could make it out of the barn, perhaps the group outside would come closer, and all he would need to do was let them leave the yard. He stepped back several more feet, keeping both hands well away from his gun. The adult took another step. The juvenile stayed close beside the good leg, constantly looking up. At the tree line, the 3 figures remained still. The largest one that had stepped out now leaned forward slightly, but did not advance again. Eli began to believe the situation might resolve itself. That belief lasted less than 10 seconds. When the injured adult placed its right foot into the mud outside the doorway, the foot slipped sideways. The entire body lost balance. It dropped hard to one knee and planted one hand in the ground, the injured shoulder jerking so sharply that a deep groan burst from its chest. The juvenile cried out and pressed close. At the same moment, all 3 shadows at the forest edge moved together. Eli almost instinctively reached toward his gun. That single motion made the large creature at the tree line stop immediately. The 2 behind it also halted. Eli realized they were watching him. He very slowly removed his hand from the gun and opened the palm beside his hip, to show he did not intend to fire. After one stretched-out moment of tension, the creature outside lowered its shoulders slightly. Eli could not know whether that meant relaxation or merely a change in posture, but the fact that the entire group reacted to his movement made him even more careful. He said in a low voice that he would not touch the juvenile and would stay out of the way. Even if the words meant nothing to them, the steady tone and empty hands conveyed some of his intention. The injured adult tried to stand again. It shifted weight to its hand and good leg, but the right leg could not hold. This time it only got halfway up before sitting down beside the post outside the shelter. Eli understood that his earlier hope had been wrong. Opening the door and backing away did not solve the problem. The adult needed more than an open path to reach the forest. While he was still considering what to do next, a warm yellow light from the house suddenly grew brighter. Tom had switched on the kitchen light or opened the curtains fully. The yard brightened enough for another shape near the western fence to become more distinct. It stood upright, broad-shouldered, with its head above the fence posts. Tom had certainly seen it too. Almost immediately, the house door opened. Eli turned and saw Tom step onto the porch holding the shotgun. Tom had not raised it, but simply bringing it outside made Eli's stomach tighten. He immediately stepped away from the barn entrance and placed himself between Tom and the forest edge. He ordered Tom to lower the gun. Tom stopped on the porch step, face pale, eyes fixed on the large figures near the trees. He asked what those things were and why Eli was standing outside alone if there were several of them. Tom genuinely believed Eli was surrounded and needed help. That was still dangerous, because a frightened person with good intentions could pull a trigger. A shape at the forest edge shifted left, seemingly trying to see around Eli. The injured adult beside the barn immediately made a deeper, stronger call than anything it had produced before. The sound vibrated across the yard and stopped. Strangely, all the figures in the forest stopped almost simultaneously. Eli looked from the group at the trees back to the injured adult, and for the first time thought that this individual was not merely answering calls. It might be sending a signal that the others understood. Each time the adult made low sounds, the forest group either stopped or answered. Each time the juvenile called, the response came more quickly. The way they reacted to each other had a clear structure. Eli turned back toward Tom and lowered his voice, telling him to look at the cattle. None had been attacked. No livestock doors had been broken. The creatures had stood at the forest edge for many minutes without approaching the house. He told Tom that a single gunshot could turn a situation that was standing still into something no one could control. Tom tightened both hands around the shotgun, looked toward the injured adult near the barn door, then noticed the juvenile. Perhaps it was the first time he had really seen the smaller creature. His face changed when he understood where the crying sound from earlier had come from. After several seconds, Tom bent down and placed the gun on the porch floor. Eli told him to sit low, keep his hands empty, and not turn on any more lights. Tom did as instructed, but did not go back inside. He wanted to see what happened on his own land, and Eli had no time to argue. With the lights dimmed, the yard returned to its familiar dark gray. The group at the tree line held position. The juvenile stood beside the injured adult, one hand touching the fur-covered arm. Tom whispered that several days earlier he had noticed some hay pulled from the shelter behind the barn. At the time he thought deer or a person passing through had taken it for a fire. 2 days later, he found more hay missing near the edge of the woods, but because no tools or livestock were gone, he ignored it. That detail immediately connected with what he had seen inside. The straw had been dragged into a broad bedding area. Feed sacks had been torn open, where they were found rather than carried away. The dry trough had fresh moisture along the edge. Blood was on the post, floor, and at exactly the height corresponding to the adult's shoulder. Tracks led into the barn with a clear dragging mark from one leg. None led toward the cattle. Everything that had first looked like a break-in now had a different meaning. Perhaps the adult had already been injured and was trying to move the juvenile through the area, but could not continue. The abandoned barn provided shelter, dry hay, and easily reached food. They had not entered the farm to hunt. They had entered because one of them could no longer walk properly. Eli felt the change in his own interpretation almost uncomfortably. From the first minute he had viewed them as a threat to identify, control, and remove from Tom's property. Now the real question was how to let an injured adult and juvenile return to their group without anyone panicking first. They were still dangerous if cornered, but danger and predatory intent were no longer the same thing. He looked at the cattle and then asked why, if the creatures were starving, they had not touched a single animal. Eli did not answer immediately. He only looked at the juvenile standing beside the adult's good leg and thought that the evidence had already answered the question. The adult braced its hand against of rest. The adult braced its hand against the post again. This time it rotated its body so the uninjured shoulder carried most of the weight, then slowly pulled its good leg under its hip. The juvenile stepped aside but did not move more than 1 step away. Eli immediately backed toward Tom, opening the area in front of the barn completely. He secured his handgun firmly in the holster so his hand would not unconsciously move toward it. The adult raised itself. Its head nearly touched the low shelter roof outside the barn. It stood at an angle, partly supported by the post, then dragged the right leg a little at a time. The first step carried it fully out from under the shelter. The second made its whole body sway. but this time it did not fall. The juvenile stood between it and the forest, walking backward several steps and then returning, as though trying to pull both sides closer together. At the tree line, the largest creature gave a pattern of 2 short, low sounds, followed by 1 longer sound. The juvenile answered at a higher pitch. Eli felt that he was standing too close to an exchange not meant for human beings. He did not know the content of the sounds, but their function had become obvious. They kept the individuals in contact and adjusted movement. The injured adult took another step. The forest was still more than 30 yards away. Eli watched the right leg drag through the mud and realized the larger one would not get far without help. Its movement out of the barn caused the forest group to shift posture. The 2 smaller adult shapes moved apart, opening a space between them. The largest remained forward. The juvenile looked at it and gave another short call. This time the large one answered, then took 1 more step out of the trees. Eli had opened the corridor, and now another individual was moving into the yard from the opposite direction. Every muscle along Eli's back tightened. Tom sat low on the porch with both hands on his knees, no longer reaching for the shotgun. Eli looked at him once to make sure, then turned back. The creature from the forest advanced slowly, each step deliberate, without running or changing direction. As it entered the weak light from the kitchen window, Eli saw that it was even larger than the injured individual. Broad shoulders, long arms, darker fur, and from the angle its head came almost level with the barn roofline. It stopped halfway between the forest and the barn. The juvenile walked toward it for 2 steps, then turned back to the injured adult. That gesture made Eli understand again that the smaller one would not leave alone. The wounded adult tried to move, but the right leg buckled slightly. It caught itself against the last post beside the yard. The large forest creature watched, made a lower sound, and the injured one answered. Eli felt the yard becoming a meeting place. For 2 sides he had no desire to stand between. He backed farther toward Tom, keeping his body angled and both hands empty. He was no longer thinking about evidence or how to explain what he was seeing. The only goal now was to avoid any movement that could be misunderstood. The large creature kept coming. Each step reduced the distance by several feet, while the other 2 shadows remained behind the trees. Eli heard mud compress beneath its feet. At this range, the scale of its body made him understand that he would be helpless if the situation changed direction. Tom sat behind him, so silent Eli nearly forgot the farmer was there. The juvenile stood beside the injured adult, both looking toward the approaching individual. When it came within 20 yards, Eli could make out its face more clearly in the gray light. Low forehead, broad nose, deep-set eyes, and an expression difficult to name but focused completely on the 2 creatures by the barn. It barely glanced at Eli. That both relieved him and made him understand something else. This creature had not entered the yard because of the sheriff, Tom, or the farm. It had come for the injured adult and the juvenile. Eli moved fully aside and opened the path completely. The large creature crossed the point where the fresh branch had earlier been placed like a boundary. It did not stop. The 2 shapes behind it held position. The juvenile made a small sound and pressed closer to the injured adult. Eli's heart beat hard, but he forced his breathing to slow. The large creature stepped into the open part of the yard, taller and more massive than anything Eli had ever faced during his career in law enforcement. It went directly toward the injured adult without changing direction or slowing, and within moments the distance between them was only a few steps. The large individual continued across the yard at a slow pace, each foot compressing the mud with a soft sound Eli could hear clearly in the silence of the farm. He stood off to the side, both hands lowered, trying to keep his body in a posture he had never learned in any training course. Every professional instinct told him that an individual of that size at close range was an uncontrollable threat, but more than an hour of observation told him that drawing his weapon now was the easiest way to make everything collapse. The creature from the forest did not look at Tom, did not care about the cattle, and barely glanced at Eli. Its entire focus was on the injured adult, leaning against the barn post. The juvenile gave a short call and ran several steps toward the newcomer, but then stopped almost immediately and looked back at the injured adult, as though remembering it could not leave. The large creature answered with a low sound, not as strong as the earlier howls, and continued forward. When it was about 10 feet from the injured one, it slowed. Eli saw its shoulders lower slightly, and both arms remained close to the body instead of raising. That small detail reminded him of the way a person approaches an injured animal, but he immediately reminded himself that he did not know what these gestures truly meant. Tom remained low on the porch, completely still. He whispered to ask whether he should go inside. Eli gave the smallest shake of his head and told him to stay where he was, because at that moment any sudden movement from behind could draw the attention of the entire group. The large creature finally reached the injured adult. The juvenile pressed close to both of them and then moved slightly aside. For several seconds, the only sounds in the yard were drizzle on the metal roof and the heavy breathing of the wounded adult. The newcomer slowly placed one hand on the uninjured shoulder. The movement was deliberate. The injured individual did not recoil. Instead, it tilted its head toward the other and made a short, low sound. The newcomer crouched down, almost squatting, then touched the area around the right leg with the other hand. The injured adult jerked its body and groaned. The juvenile immediately stepped closer, placing both hands on the large arm in front of it. Eli felt his throat dry. He had tried to keep a practical mindset since entering the barn, but the scene in front of him made terms like unidentified animal feel too cold and inadequate. What he was watching looked more like an examination of an injury than a simple instinctive reaction. The larger individual sniffed or inspected the leg for several seconds, then looked toward the injured adult. The two exchanged several low, interrupted sounds unlike growls. Eli did not know whether it was communication in the human sense or merely social signaling, but clearly one individual was changing its behavior based on the reaction of the other. Tom saw it too. He no longer glanced toward the shotgun on the porch. His face remained tense, but fear had mixed with something closer to astonishment. The large creature stood first. It turned toward the forest, looked at the clear route Eli had created, then back at the wounded adult. After that, it lowered itself and put an arm beneath the uninjured shoulder to provide support. The injured adult used the barn post to pull itself up. This time, it did not try to carry all its weight on the good leg. Part of its body leaned against the assisting individual. They stood that way for several seconds to find balance. The juvenile squeezed close beside the good leg, head constantly lifting. Eli saw the group's plan becoming clearer. They had not come to confront anyone. They were trying to bring an injured member back to the forest. He stepped sideways to move an empty bucket out of the path, then used his foot to shift a rake, leaning against a post. Every motion was slow and deliberate. The large creature looked at him once, but did not release the injured one. Eli stopped as soon as the path was clear. The two creatures began to move. The first step was difficult but successful. The second was slower. The injured adult dragged its right leg through the mud, its shoulder leaning heavily against the supporting individual. The juvenile stayed tight against the other side, nearly touching its hip. The tree line was still more than 20 yards away, but for the first time, Eli could see a realistic way for them to leave the property without direct human intervention. At that exact moment, his shoulder radio crackled and Martha's voice became clearer. She reported that a deputy in the southern sector had heard part of the earlier traffic and was asking whether Eli wanted assistance. Eli felt his stomach muscles tighten. Under normal circumstances, the answer would have been simple. An officer alone facing multiple large unidentified animals on occupied property should call for backup. That protected the officer, the witness, and the agency. But Eli pictured another patrol vehicle rushing into the yard with bright headlights, a deputy stepping out without any context, then seeing figures more than 7 feet tall in the dark. That person would not have had more than an hour to watch how the creatures responded to light, distance, and guns. He would have only seconds to decide whether he was in danger. Eli understood that one panicked gunshot could destroy the fragile balance they had managed to keep. He brought the radio close to his mouth and told Martha the situation remained stable and that no one should be sent unless he specifically requested it. Martha asked again to confirm. Eli looked at the group in front of him. The supporting individual was helping the injured one, the juvenile remained close, and 2 other shapes still kept their distance near the trees. He repeated the decision. When he lowered the radio, he felt its weight differently. If anything went wrong afterward, he would have to explain why he refused backup. This was no longer an instinctive reaction. He was deliberately placing his personal judgment above the safest procedural choice. Tom had heard part of the exchange and looked at Eli with a mixture of worry and understanding. The farmer did not object. Perhaps after what he had seen, he also understood that more guns did not necessarily mean more safety. Eli walked to the SUV and placed the flashlight on the hood so its beam pointed low at the ground rather than directly at the group. The fixed light created a dim path bright enough to see but not to blind any of the individuals. When he returned, the group had advanced several more yards. The injured adult still moved extremely slowly, each step dragging the right leg into a short trench in the mud. The supporting individual carried much of its left side. The juvenile stayed beside the good leg. At the forest edge, the other 2 shapes split to either side, creating an opening between the trees like a passage for the central group. Eli did not want to assign strategy to their positions, but the arrangement matched everything he had seen so far. The group appeared to know the injured individual needed a clear corridor. They reached roughly halfway across the yard when the wounded adult's right leg suddenly slipped, its massive body tilted hard. The supporting creature tried to hold it, but the weight was too great and both swayed sideways. The injured one dropped onto a knee, braced a hand in the mud, and released a deeper sound of pain, stronger than before. The juvenile jumped back and then rushed beside it. The 2 figures at the forest edge immediately moved out. Eli felt his heart hammer. He knew this was exactly the kind of moment that someone without patience could misread as an attack. But the 2 new individuals did not move toward him. They went directly toward the injured member. One stopped near the fence, turning its head slightly toward Tom's house as though checking the surroundings. The other continued forward, came to the opposite side of the injured adult, and lowered itself. Now Eli could clearly see at least 4 adults and 1 juvenile on the property. Every adult was larger than he was, and the nearest stood only a few dozen feet away. The sense of vulnerability became so concrete that Eli's hands felt cold inside his gloves. Yet the fear was no longer the same as when he first saw the fur-covered hand inside the barn. Then he had feared what he could not understand. Now he feared a human mistake more. The second individual approached the injured adult and slid an arm beneath the opposite side. Together with the first helper, it raised the upper body little by little. The injured adult planted its good foot in the ground and finally stood between the 2 supporting individuals. The juvenile moved out in front, walked several steps, then turned back. Tom stared at the scene for a long time. He said quietly that he had never seen any animal do that. Eli replied that neither had he. The simple answer made him realize he had stopped searching for a familiar comparison. He was no longer thinking of bears, mountain lions, or people in costumes. He was only watching what was in front of him and accepting that his previous experience was not enough to explain it. The 3 central adults began moving again. The injured one stayed in the middle, while the 2 larger individuals supported part of its weight from each side. The juvenile walked directly ahead, occasionally looking back. The fourth adult remained behind the group. The arrangement formed a slow but stable cluster. Eli and Tom did not move. The distance to the forest dropped from 20 yards to 15, then to around 10. With every yard they covered, Eli felt part of the pressure leave his chest. He began to believe the night might end without anyone pulling a trigger. The drizzle thickened, making the surface of the yard shine under the low light. Large footprints appeared one after another in the mud, mixed with the smaller juvenile tracks and the drag mark from the injured leg. Eli briefly thought about evidence and how the rain might erase the tracks, but he did not step closer to examine them. Tonight, getting them out safely mattered more than proving what he had seen. When the group was about 8 yards from the trees, the individual following behind suddenly stopped. It turned and looked at Eli. He noticed the movement immediately, and the relief forming inside him disappeared. The other 3 adults continued guiding the injured member toward the tree line. The juvenile followed, but the one in the rear did not rejoin them. It turned its entire body toward Eli and stood still. Tom noticed as well, and shifted his weight slightly on the porch. Eli raised one hand low, signaling him not to move. The creature stared directly at Eli for several seconds. The distance between them was less than 30 feet. Then it took one step toward him. Eli felt instinct pull his right hand toward the pistol, but he held it where it was. The creature took a second step. Mud sank beneath its large foot. It made no sound, did not raise its hands, and did not crouch, but its size gave every step more weight than any spoken threat. Eli forced himself to watch the entire body instead of focusing only on the face. Its shoulders were not raised, its arms remained down. Behind it, the group was almost at the forest edge. The injured adult leaned heavily on the 2 supporting members while the juvenile looked back toward the one that had stopped. Eli understood that if he drew his weapon now, he would violate the same principle that had kept everyone alive so far. He kept both hands empty and turned his body slightly sideways to appear less confrontational. The creature came forward one more step and stopped. The distance was now less than 20 feet. Eli could hear its breathing, slow and deep. Tom remained motionless behind him. The forest had stopped howling, and even the livestock were silent. In that stillness, Eli clearly understood that he was no longer controlling the scene in the way a sheriff normally understood control. He was only controlling his own choices. The creature looked at him, then turned its eyes toward the group leading the injured adult into the trees. After several seconds, it looked back at Eli. He did not know what it wanted, but he knew the only thing he could do was remain consistent with the decision that had brought them this far. So Eli stood still without touching the gun while the large creature remained less than 20 feet away, and the rest of the group slowly disappeared into the darkness behind it. The creature stood less than 20 feet from Eli, close enough that I could see its breath appearing as thin white clouds in the cold air. Eli's right hand was near enough to his pistol that one habitual movement would put the grip in his palm, but he understood that the same motion might destroy everything. From the beginning of the night, every time he moved toward his weapon, the figures in the forest tensed or changed position. So he kept both hands low, angled his shoulders, and tried to breathe evenly, even though his chest felt compressed. The low light from the flashlight on the SUV hood was enough for Eli to see beads of water collecting on the dark fur, the heavy lines around the eyes, and the chest rising and falling with each breath. Behind it, the others had almost reached the forest. 2 large individuals supported the injured adult. The juvenile stayed just ahead and kept looking back. Eli knew the creature in front of him might only be checking him, might be warning him, or might want to make sure the armed man would not follow. After several seconds, Eli said quietly that he was not there to hurt them. He knew the words might mean nothing, but his tone, posture, and empty hands at least showed he was not taking aggressive action. It looked down at Eli's hands, then at the pistol in the holster, then back at his face. The moment lasted long enough for Eli to feel every muscle in his back tighten. A short, low sound came from the tree line. The creature in front of Eli answered with an even lower sound, then stepped backward without taking its eyes off him. It took another step back, finally turned fully, and walked toward the group. Eli still did not dare take a full breath until the distance had doubled. The creature approached the juvenile, stopped, and placed a hand on the smaller one's shoulder for a moment. The juvenile turned to look back toward the barn, then at Eli. The two adults supporting the injured individual entered the darkness beneath the trees first. The creature that had faced Eli followed last, while another group member held position near the edge until everyone else had passed. Every step was still slow because the injured adult leaned heavily on both sides. Tree trunks gradually hid their shoulders, heads, and arms, until only the sound of branches breaking faded deeper into the forest. One final low sound came from farther away, and then the property fell silent. Tom was still sitting on the porch with both hands on his knees, as Eli had instructed. Only when Eli was sure there was no more movement at the tree line did he signal that Tom could stand. The farmer came down into the yard slowly, stared toward the place where the group had vanished, then looked back at the barn as though trying to confirm that what had happened truly belonged to his own property. He asked Eli what he was going to write in the report. Late autumn rain began falling more heavily, small drops striking the metal roof and darkening the mud. Eli looked across the yard, where the large tracks were still clearly visible, and told Tom the first thing they needed to do was check the livestock and make sure there was no additional damage. The cattle were still clustered together, but once the group in the forest had moved away, several animals began shifting and making low sounds. Only a small amount of feed was missing from the torn sacks. The tension on Tom's face eased, replaced by heavy confusion. In only a few hours, both men had gone from believing there was an intruder on the property to confronting something they had no suitable language to describe. Eli stopped Tom from taking a flashlight and following the tracks into the woods. The group was still nearby. The adult was injured, and pursuing them in darkness could turn the peaceful decision they had just made into a mistake. Eli crouched near the path where the group had crossed and saw large footprints overlapping in the mud. Among them were smaller prints, clear at the heel and showing 5 toes. One line of large tracks had an uneven rhythm, with a long drag mark every few steps where the right leg scraped the ground. The smaller tracks remained close to that line, sometimes so close they nearly touched. What he saw matched every movement he had observed, and that only made the feeling of unreality more difficult. This was no longer a vague shape at the forest edge that he might persuade himself he had identified. He told Tom to lock the house, keep the dogs inside, and call again if anything returned. Then he went back to the sheriff's office before dawn, carrying a story he did not yet know how to fit into any kind of report. Eli's initial report recorded only a call involving unidentified animals, causing damage to a barn, blood, and several large footprints. Not because he had changed his mind about what he had seen, but because he understood that an official report required things that could be checked again. At first light, he returned to the farm with 2 deputies under the explanation of inspecting damage and wildlife sign. The rain had weakened for a while, enough for several tracks to retain their shape. Inside the barn, the compressed straw remained in 2 separate areas in the far corner. One broad depression matched where the adult had rested, while a smaller one lay directly beside it. Broken boards showed force from the inside. Blood remained on the post, floor, and threshold, some of it washed into thin streaks by rain. Outside, the younger deputy placed his boot next to a large print and shook his head. The track was clearly longer than his boot and wide at the forefoot. Beside it was a smaller print traveling almost parallel. One deputy suggested a bear could make distorted tracks when its hind foot overlapped the front. Eli led them to the line of prints with the uneven rhythm and the long drag mark beside the right leg. The smaller prints stayed beside that line, sometimes almost touching it. They followed the tracks a short distance toward the forest, but the rain began falling harder. Water filled the deeper parts, blurring the toes before their eyes. Eli knew that if they wanted better evidence, they needed cameras, measuring tools, and someone experienced with wildlife tracks. But by then the scene was changing too quickly. One deputy asked why a large animal searching for food would leave the cattle untouched. The question made Eli look toward the old barn. He remembered the juvenile drinking water, the large arm pulling it behind the adult, the group from the forest supporting the injured individual step by step across the yard. He did not answer. Instead, he told them to document the physical damage and leave the species identification as undetermined. No one collected a sample strong enough to turn that night into scientific evidence. The blood in the barn was not sent for testing either, a decision Eli later sometimes wondered might have cost him the only real opportunity. But at the time he did not want to draw more people to the property, and he certainly did not want the woods behind the farm turned into a search zone. The final report was so dry that anyone reading it would see only an unusual wildlife incident. Eli lived with the difference between a few lines on paper and what his own eyes had seen. In the years that followed, he rarely spoke about the night at the Ridley farm. Veteran law enforcement officers understand how easily credibility can be damaged by one story other people consider absurd. Eli also had no desire to become the man who appeared at fairs, radio shows, or Bigfoot hunts, repeating the same experience to crowds. When a close colleague asked years later what had really been inside the barn, Eli only said that some things were better left in the woods. He did not mean it as a mysterious answer. To him, it was the most practical conclusion from that night. Tom continued living on the farm. During the first several years, he occasionally called Eli after heavy late autumn rains to mention footprints appearing near the edge of the property. The tracks were usually large, following the tree line before disappearing, before reaching the barn. Once, Tom saw a smaller set running beside them. He did not set traps, did not bring people out to search, and did not lose any significant amount of feed afterward. His cattle did not disappear. The old barn was not damaged again. His two dogs sometimes still avoided the western side on very quiet nights, but by morning everything would be normal. Over time, Tom stopped viewing the tracks as evidence of an intrusion. He treated them more like a presence at the edge of the property, something he knew might be there but did not need to challenge. The story of the 2:17 a.m. night eventually escaped into the wider world, mainly through second-hand accounts from people who had known Eli or Tom. Many years later, it appeared on Bigfoot forums and blogs, with some local details changing depending on the version. There was no clear photograph, confirmed DNA sample, or official document stating that a sheriff had encountered Sasquatch. What remained was only the story, several vague lines in a report, and the memories of the people who had actually been there. Eli never asked anyone to believe him. What haunted him was not the size of the creatures, but the choice that had taken place in the dark yard. He could have drawn his gun, called more officers, and turned everything into a confrontation. He did not, and they left without harming anyone. For Eli, that was enough to live with the remaining question. Perhaps he had misidentified some animal under poor lighting and memory, and time had done the rest. Or perhaps, on a rainy night in 1997, he truly stood between a Sasquatch family and the forest waiting for them to return. The answer never appeared. There were only the footprints that occasionally came back to the edge of Tom's land, while not a single cow went missing, as though whatever lived beyond the trees still remembered the place where it had once been left alone.